Hi, welcome to my channel. As you can see, I just came in from outside. I'm all wrapped up. I wanted to make this video because somebody mentioned this to me. At both of my videos or all of my videos of my mom and dad, um, there was a common theme among them, which was our faith. I mentioned how my dad was baptized on the day that he was born, just before the Cristero War, and of course my mom was a regular at church, daily mass. And I want to tell a little bit about my faith journey. And my first memories, of course, were from Tijuana. I must have been about 3 years old, and I remember going to church on a Sunday. That was one particular one. I'm sure I went other times, but it was just a walk down the dirt road to the church. I don't remember much of the church. I don't think it was much. There was much there, but I know that we celebrated Christmas, and I know that we went to church regularly, and I seem to remember people wearing crucifixes, and we came to the United States, and we moved around to a couple of different places. While we were in Boyle Heights, we attended Our Lady of Talpa Church, and also La Placita, the church down in downtown LA near Alvera Street. Then, of course, we moved into South LA, and my parents put us right away into Catholic school, and we attended the parish nearby, Nativity, on 57th and Vermont. And because we went to mass every single week, the entire family. We took up a whole row. There were 7 kids at one point by the early 70s, and my mom and dad. So there were 9 of us in a pew. We would always go in the entire pew, and then when it was time for communion, my parents would get out, and they would lead us. All the kids would get in single file and go up to the front. Back then, they did the communion rail where we knelt, but that was common, and that was very typical. And I remember that my father had a suit that he wore on Sundays. He was an auto mechanic, so he had no need for a suit for work. We didn't get invited to enough social events, but he had a suit for church, and I had a suit for church. I didn't have a lot of other clothes, like I don't have a lot of play clothes, and they were all, in different stages of being ripped up. But I had a suit for Sundays. And of course, going to Nativity, I did my first communion when I was in the second grade, and I had already done my confirmation, so there was no need for that. And then my first confession, of course, first, and then my first communion in second grade. And because of the faith in my family, and I never thought about it, I just went on to church every single Sunday, and I went to learn my Catholic faith instructions. Um, in school, they had an hour for math, an hour for English, and then there was an hour for religion. And that's when they would teach us about our faith. When it was in the lower grades, they may have given us little handouts, teaching us different prayers. And of course, in the Catholic Church, there is the calendar year. Um, most of the year is ordinary time, but then there are seasons, Advent and Lent, when there are certain set days, before Easter, and then even after Easter, and then Christmas, and then after Christmas. And so I learned all about those, and I learned the prayers, and I learned there were a lot of songs, and we learned those, and then there were special masses that we would attend. We never missed a holy day of obligation, and they used to make kids go to church every morning. And I kind of remember that at one point they changed it where it was only once a week, and the kids cheered because we didn't want to go to mass. But it was part of our childhood. It was part of growing up. There was our home life, and there was church, and we would, of course, like I said, go to church every single Sunday without fail. And I remember that some of the instructions in school, um, when we got to the higher grades, was like the fourth, fifth, and sixth grade, before I transferred to Holy Cross for middle school, they would show us a catechism, and it was a kid's catechism. I believe it was the Baltimore Catechism, um, But in the book, there were like instructions on our faith about the Ten Commandments and various verses from the Bible about the seven deadly sins and the seven virtues and cardinal virtues. And so we learned all of those, and it was a lot of illustrations in the book to make it easier for kids. And I remember that one in particular that really struck in my mind was there was an illustration of a man stealing something, and there's a bubble where he's thinking, and he's thinking, nobody sees me as he's stealing something. And above him was a cloud, and then there was a little bubble coming out of the cloud. This was God in the cloud saying, I see you. And then there was one on marriage where there was a couple and they were in front of a priest, and the priest says, you are now married. And above them was a cloud, and there was a little bubble that comes out, and it was God speaking, saying, yes, you're married. You're married now. Next to that, there was one that's where this judge was telling them, you're divorced. And above them, there was a cloud that said, you're still married. There was also one where the couple's getting married, and the judge says, you are now married. And the cloud above them, God speaking, the little bubble says, you are not married. And um, I'm not sure of the intent, but I always thought about that because I came to believe and to understand that God is with us everywhere. Um, I'm never alone. I'm never doing something that God doesn't know I'm doing. And so I always had that in the back of my head. If I'm thinking I'm getting away with something, I'm not getting away with anything. And of course, in my faith, if I ever did um, commit a sin, I would go to confession. There was a window there where I didn't, but for the most part, I would go to confession, usually with school. And then, of course, I went on to Cathedral High School, and there was more education. We went on retreats. In Cathedral, we read the Bible. We had actually a Jerusalem Bible, which is the one that I recommend. They refer to it as a impressive work of scholarship. I think Tolkien worked on it. Some big names worked in the translation and in the interpretations. And there are introductions and there are commentary and there are footnotes that kind of explain different lines, different verses, with commentary sometimes referring back to the original Hebrew or Aramaic, or what this phrase, this verse may be a reference to. It was very good, very interesting. And that was for the 4 years in uh, theology. Now it's theology class. They taught us all of this. And so, and I always felt a closeness to God. I would pray. And, but, in my 20s, like a lot of us, started to fall away from the church. And then I remember the morning that I didn't want to get up, and my dad was insisting that I get up because we got to go to church, and I didn't get up, and they left without me, and so I stopped going to church. And they would go, and I just wouldn't go. Looking back, I'm sure that it really bothered my parents, especially my dad, but both of them. But I was very rational about it, I thought, and I came to sometimes argue with people that religion was a crutch and it was the means of controlling people. I remember going to Europe and seeing these beautiful cathedrals, beautiful churches, and then I was still going to church and religious. I would go to mass. Sometimes I would sneak out and go to mass by myself. And that was at 17 years old. When I got older into my 20s, I stopped going to church, and I kind of like thought of it like as I said. It was just didn't care for it. I would say that I was not against organized religion or somehow not with organized religion, and that included everything, right? I mean, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, anything that had some sort of structure to it, because people now say that they're not religious, they're spiritual, and I guess I would fall into that category. I believed in God, but I didn't want to be tied down to any particular faith. And in my 20s, I kind of that's the way that I was, which is not uncommon. Sometimes kids go off to college and they come back atheists. They have some philosophy class or psychology class, and they leave their faith, their parents, which is an awful thing. Um, but then what happened to me was that I was dating a girl, Wendy Griffin, and we had just started dating. And one day in conversation, she seemed a little down, and she said that that I was Catholic and that was a problem. I'm like, really? I don't even go to church. And she says, no, but you were brought up Catholic, and she had an issue with Mary, that we worship Mary. And I've heard that before. And I was like, oh, well, we don't worship Mary. No, we honor Mary. In fact, when we go to Mass, there are readings from the Bible. The first and second readings are usually a book from the Old Testament, one of the epistles, and then the gospel is right from one of the gospels. Mary is only mentioned when if she were to come up, and the other times that she's mentioned is in the Mea Culpa and in the Nicene Creed, Lord of the Virgin Mary. I mean, that's the extent of it. Now, in truth, we do have a special place for Mary, but she thought it was different, and she was not well versed in religion, especially in Catholicism. So I went to look things up to kind of like argue my point, and so I started looking things up, and I tell this to people that know me that that's where I started, and I ended up reading more and more, and went back to reference my Bible, and I read about the faith that she had. She was a Baptist. I read about the Protestant Reformation. I just thought that there were Catholics and Protestants, but no, there were actually, of course, back in it was 1054, where the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church had the official split, right? And I learned about apostolic succession, how the Orthodox Church has roots to the apostles' apostolic succession, the laying of the hands, just like the Catholic Church does. And among Protestants, I learned that there were mainly Protestants, like your Episcopals and your Anglicans and your Lutherans and your Methodists, and but there were also evangelical Christians, which are non-denominational, which were just a pastor developed a following, and they went back to like a very prehistoric church where there's like just a room in a warehouse, and it's like a multi-purpose room, and he'll preach on Sundays, and he'll read from the Bible, and that was another type of Christianity. Anyway, she started me on this. Wendy did, and I started reading, and I was reading more, and I learned more and more about my faith, and I came to appreciate it very differently. And then my father and I would talk about it. And when I was in that window of 5 years, my father and I would talk about religion. I would sometimes speak about it, pejoratively. It was used to control people, and I didn't believe a lot of things. And but later on, when I started reading more, some of it seemed incredibly interesting, and then some things made sense. Um, One thing that Wendy did say at one point, she gave me this beautiful book on churches, and she says, I have to admit, Catholics have the most beautiful churches. And they are. They're cathedrals, but even the more modest ones are beautiful. I just went back to Mexico, and I went to Guanajuato, and there were churches like every third street, and they were all beautiful. And I learned about how they're structured, and you know the stained glass, and people that before people were literate. Literacy is a newer phenomena, because everyone had to work to survive. That the stained glass windows were ways of teaching them the Bible. There were images from Scripture, either the Gospels or the Old Testament, the Great Flood. They were in those windows, and people would learn. And as I kept learning more and more, um, it became more and more special to me. And I started attending church, more regularly. And I started doing what my parents did, which is I would go to daily mass when I could. When I was working downtown, at noon, I would go to the cathedral and attend mass. And when I came back to church after that 5 year period, I remember going back, and things had changed a little bit. Now people were walking up single file and receiving on their hands. That never seemed right to me, and I always liked the way that I used to do it. Back then we would go on the altar rail and receive, kneeling on the tongue. But now we're setting single file, and so I would go single file, and they would, you know, be ready to put it on my hand. And I never did it that way. I'd take it on the tongue. That just seemed right to me, and I didn't want to touch it with my hands. That didn't seem right. And I later read in St. Teresa of Avila, one of her books, where she describes a vision she had where she would see a vision of hell, and she knew who the priests in hell were because there were burn marks on their hands from having touched the consecrated host. Um, because only priests are consecrated, and that's why they can hold the Eucharist, but our hands aren't consecrated. And there's now some debate over the early church and people receiving on the hand back then and so on. Um, but I never did that. And then I also thought about kneeling like I had before. And at first I was very self-conscious about it, but I decided that I was going to start kneeling. And I didn't want to call attention to myself. I was very self-conscious about it, but then I did. I just thought that was right. And I thought that, maybe it would inspire other people to also kneel. So then, for a long time, and even to this day, when I go to communion, I'll kneel and when I receive communion. And as I'm learning more and more, I remember joining a Catholic prayer group. And in the Catholic prayer group, we read the first book we read was Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton. And then we read Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. And then City of God, Augustine, and Confessions by Augustine. Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologica. Um, just tons of books. And the one that made the biggest impact on me was Crossing the Threshold of Hope by John Paul II, which I sometimes refer to as St. John Paul the Great. Um, and the book is structured in a way where the way it happened is that he was supposed to give an interview to a journalist, but he couldn't. So he asked the journalist, send me your questions and I'll respond. And that became the book. And one of the reasons I like it so much is because the questions are the questions that all of us have about salvation and the crucifixion, about God. And the Pope answers them. And he answers them, I believe, very effectively. Um, I remember Dennis Prager once saying that he was asked to speak at an atheist convention, which he thought was ironic, and of course it is. This religious Jew speaking to a group of atheists asked to speak, and he asked them an interesting question. He asked them, "How many of you have ever questioned your atheism?" And nobody raised their hand. They were all very secure in their atheism. And he said, for all of us that are religious, we question our faith all the time. It's true. We question it all the time. We're always wondering. But our reason tells us that we believe is true and it's good. And so we continue. And so, I question my faith as most Christians do, but I continue um, for many reasons. Some of it is reason, but maybe the biggest one is because I find it beautiful. My daughter was taking a philosophy class and they were discussing moral relativism. And the teacher was arguing against moral relativism. And so, of course, I support that. And so we had this discussion, but we talked about what moral relativism is and what objective morality is. And in that conversation, I told her, that people would say, well, all of us agree that murder is wrong. And I told her, well, actually, we don't all agree that. When the missionaries were first going into the Northern Europe, they had a hard time converting them because they all believed in survival of the fittest. They would kill the weakest person and take their land or take their property. That's the way, and they thought that that was a reasonable way of doing it. The strongest one is, was overpower the weaker ones. That's also the reason for slavery. That's the way that it started. That's the way it was rationalized for thousands of years. And then, of course, when the uh, Europeans went into first the Americas and then into Polynesia, what did they run across? These tribes of people that practice cannibalism. The Aztecs practice and the Mayas practice human sacrifices, right? Um, and then people usually didn't go up willingly. They would overpower the weaker and they would kill them. And to them, I mean, moral, subjective morality, and something that people don't understand is about the ethical monotheism and how, and this I learned, of course, in my faith and ethical monotheism, belief in one God, um, develops into a objective morality. There's one morality. We all believe this. We would all consider the same things right or wrong, like stealing, like a murder. Um, it's in the Bible, the Ten Commandments in the Bible. That there's no place in the Bible that it says Ten Commandments. They're referred to as the Decalogue. That's particularly the Septuagint, and I'll explain that in another video. Decalogue means 10 words. If you look at the Ten Commandments, there are like 12 statements. So they have to like massage them into the Ten Commandments. But that's objective morality. And then, as we're going further in this conversation with my daughter and myself, I mentioned this, and this is where it comes back around, that there is something as objective beauty, and that's very important. Objective beauty. And we think, well, something like might sometimes look at a woman and think that one woman's beautiful, and another woman's not quite as attractive. She's more plain. But somebody else may find the reverse, right? Or somebody might say that this objective object is beautiful, but somebody else says, well, I don't find it beautiful. I find something else beautiful. But there are things that we sometimes see that nobody would debate. And that's sometimes in nature when you're turning a corner and you get to a place where there's a wonderful waterfall and there's beautiful mist and green trees and beautiful nature. And everyone would say universally, that's beautiful. Nobody looks at a landfill and thinks, well, that's beautiful to me, it may not be beautiful to you, but it's no, now landfill is ugly, then it's not supposed to be beautiful. But nobody would go and see this beautiful landscape and say, well, no, it's not beautiful to me. Everyone would be inspired by it. Everyone thinks that way. And this can be extended to other things that are beautiful. And I find my faith beautiful. Have things happen? I mean, I went to a service and a man was telling me about it, his non-faith, and he talked about religion and all the bad things that have happened. And I know those bad things have happened, but and I didn't argue. It was somebody that I mean, you don't want to argue with somebody at the funeral for somebody that they lost that they loved. So I just listened to him, But I'll say this in this video that um, the faith is beautiful. People sometimes do bad things. So you might say, well, this priest, did something horrible, but that just doesn't negate that the faith that he was supposed to be living is beautiful. There's a disconnect. The church sometimes does really awful things and people will leave the church. Well, I won't listen to those leaders of the church that did the bad things, but the faith is still beautiful. The Eucharist, confession, the sacraments, the way that we worship, it's beautiful. And so that came into the conversation. And as I've come along, this is something more recent, but as I was growing right along, I remember at one point listening to a video and someone was talking about um, this man named Jesse Romero who would he would say a daily rosary in Latin. And I've prayed rosaries before, and I still do a daily rosary. Um, but he explained why he did it in Latin, and this is the reason. He said he had an experience where he went to an exorcism, and there were a priest there, two priests there. They were reciting the rite of exorcism, and it was in English, and they weren't making any headway. And then a more experienced exorcist arrived, who began reciting the prayers, the rite of exorcism in Latin, and that helped them, and they were able to exorcise this demon from this person right away. Exorcism is a very interesting topic, and I'll discuss that in another video. But I was struck by that, and I went back and I decided to reread some of the Latin writings. And my father recently gave me a book. He lent it to me. I tried to give it back, and he told me to keep it for a little while longer. But it's a book of devotions and prayers, and they're in Spanish on one side and Latin on the other side. And I love reading them. And the reason that Latin is so special is because other languages, English, French, Spanish, it's been corrupted. People say horrible things in those languages. Even though there's some beautiful, some of the tones are beautiful sounding, they've been corrupted by comedians or people that just misuse the language and they'll say horrible things. But Latin, since it's not spoken by any country, is pure. I mean, it's only used in the church and it's used in law. And so that's why Latin is unique. And so I decided to start reading, and now I do a daily rosary. I say 2 rosaries a day, the morning and the evening, and I say them in Latin. And that's become a big part of my faith. The other thing is sometimes I'll attend church here in my parish, but I try to go at least once a month to the Latin Mass. The Latin Mass is about an hour and a half long. I had to buy a missalette to follow them, but it's beautiful. And there we always receive communion on the altar rail on our knees. And sometimes when I go to other churches, I'll stand in line with everyone and they're all receiving on the hand, but I'll see someone up in front that'll kneel. And I love that. I always find it so inspiring that they made the decision that I made. It's sometimes awkward, it calls attention to you, but you think that that's the right way to receive, and so you do it. I don't impose it on anyone else. It's still, I encourage people to go to communion, go to confession, go to communion. When I think about it, this is the decision that I've made, and so this is why I do it. I sometimes attend my parish, and I attend the Mass that's in Mandarin. And I do because when I do, I love seeing everyone reciting the Mass, and I can follow along. I know exactly where they are. I know when everyone kneels. I know when everyone, does the Mea Culpa, and we upon our chest. When they say the Our Father, when they say the Our Father, I recite it in Latin. When they say the Nicene Creed, I know exactly the point where we kneel, born of the Virgin Mary, became man. I kneel at the exact point. The only thing I don't understand is the homily. But I love seeing this in another language. When I was younger and I traveled a lot, I would sometimes go to churches in Hong Kong or in Korea, and I'd go into the church on Sundays and I hear mass in their language, and I knew exactly what was going on. If I had a missal, I would know because of the date what the readings were. Um, and then we would always participate in the Eucharist, and I would always go up to communion. And I was in a lot of places for a long time. Um, they did not receive in the hand; they would receive on the tongue at least. I'm trying to think back if they knelt. I don't think that they knelt. They stood in line, but they received it on the tongue. But I think that that's beautiful, And uh, fast forward now, it's to 2024, and when 2019 happened, uh, COVID-19, and then the shutdown in 2020, um, the church shut down the churches. And I remember that at one point I went to see if I could find a church that was open. I think it was on a Saturday. And when that happened, my family, my wife and my children, we used to go to mass every single Sunday. And of course, when they said that we didn't have to, they all decided not to. But I would still try to find a church. And I went to our parish or my kids' school's parish. When I get there, there's a priest out in front hearing confessions. So I thought, oh, I'll park and I'll do a confession. And I was the second to last one in line. When I get up to him, I say my confession, I receive absolution. And then he says, we're going to have mass inside. Would you like to stay? Oh, that'd be wonderful, of course. I waited outside a little bit. He heard the last confession. Then he told me to follow him. We went into the church. And as I go inside, there are about 30 people inside. And as he closes the door, he locks it behind me. We were hearing mass in secret. That was beautiful. You know, and then ever since then, when they opened them again, kids didn't want to go back to church. They're older now; they're driving, and so they didn't want to go. And I don't believe in pressuring them or forcing them to go. And I don't know, it's impossible for me to force them. They're as big as me, actually. Alex is as big as me, and Sophia's a grown woman. Um, but I wish that they would go back to mass. And I bought them a few years back. I went to a Catholic store and I bought crucifixes. And I was going to give them some separately if I saw them separately, but they were both home at the same time. So I called them both together. and I gave them their little boxes with their crucifixes. And I told them, I know that they don't go to church, um, and I know that they don't even consider themselves Catholic anymore or nominally Catholic. But I gave them those crucifixes because maybe one day they were going to think about it, and they might need to put that on and wear it. They may want to. And I hope that that day comes one day. And I hope that they put on their crucifixes. Um, since then, of course, I've been going to church. My daughter's gone to church maybe once. They came to church with me last year for my birthday. Um, and they're about the age that I was when I walked away also. And so a lot of kids, especially in the college age, when they go to college, a lot of this happens. But I hope that they come back, and I hope that they continue this faith of our fathers that has come up to me. One of the few things that I asked my dad for was our family Bible, which I have here. And anyway, I'm going to. I did a earlier video and I stumbled when I recited a prayer. So this time, so I don't stumble, I'm going to have it here in front of me in case I need to refer to it. But I'm going to end this video with two prayers, the Pater Noster and the Ave Maria, in Latin. Pater Noster, qui in celis sanctificatur nomen tuum, avegna regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua sicut in cielo in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitti nobis debita nostra, sicut nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, se libera nos a malo. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc in hora mortis nostri. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Thanks for watching this. I will make some more videos on this, on our faith. It's very important, and I think it's very interesting. And I'll post them as they come to me. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe. And put a comment down. Comment even if you don't agree with me or you want to challenge me, that'd be fine. Just respectful. And I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.